Talking about materials. And a big question to think about is how do materials affect design? So we're going to talk about four or three different components about materials. The first one that you're more familiar with is the idea of aesthetics. So aesthetics has to do with how something looks, right? So I want you to look around your room again. What are the materials of your room? The colors of your wall, the materials of the flooring, the materials of your ceiling. What are those materials and how do you feel about them? Right? If you want to take a longer look at this, take a look around your house. The exterior materials. Is it brick? Is it stucco? How do you feel and what do you think as an aesthetic when it comes to those materials? So when it comes to aesthetics, we have to think about, color theory, style, combination of colors, a combination of materials, location. So there's a lot to think about, but in a very simple sense is the materials is what's in a way dressing or creating the facade and the what people actually get to see of the design. The second part, which is really important, is the structural and durability of a project. So you want that your design lasts for a very long time, right? There might be maintenance and things that need to be rebuilt, but the whole idea is that it's able to last for a long time. So this is the structural durability side of it. So this is where you start to think about the context. Where are you building? If you're building using wood, but there's a lot of termite in that area, sure, there's ways to prevent that, but maybe there's also a lot of water. And so is that the best place to build using that material, right? Or if you're building using materials that can easily rust in an area that is prone to those materials being affected by rust, is it the best idea, right? So thinking about the context, thinking about durability, how long is it gonna last, right? Does it need to be replaced every so often? Those are things that as a designer, as an engineer, as an architect, you might leave the project, but the client or whoever lives or uses that space is going to stay with these materials. And so you want to be able to provide durable materials, right? And then, which kind of brings to the idea of how to build it. Right? Do you have someone in that area that can actually build or use those materials? Do people know how to build using that type of material? There's a lot of different ways to build something, and there's specific things that maybe need more specific types of installation, types of ways of using, right? So how is it really going to be built? And the last part when it comes to the structural is the different components. Each material has a specific characteristic or integrity that's going to be related to that material. And so this brings the question, right? How does the material react when it's being compressed or pressed on? How does it react when it's being in tension, when it's being stretched out, right? So each material is going to react differently. This has to do with the properties, right? But it also is going to have to do with length, with width, with height, right? If you have something that's short and you want to break it, maybe it's going to break very differently as if it was, imagine this was a ruler, wooden ruler, and you have a small ruler. Which one do you think is going to break easily, right? You've sort of seen that some of those, the longer it gets, it starts to sort of bend and fold easier. So again, that has to do with the material itself, but also has to do with the depth, with the thickness, the length, and the specific characteristics, right? And this is where materials testing and understanding the materials on a structural level becomes very, very important to know which ones you're going to use. And the last one has to do with sustainability. Sustainability is how are you, one, obtaining the materials. So imagine you want to build with wood, but you want a very specific type of wood that has to be brought from South America. So how do you get that? Most likely it has to be shipped either on a plane and a boat, and some trucking. All of that is to obtain some sort of material, right? But what if you would have gotten another specific wood that was more local, that you could have bought at Home Depot or at Lowe's somewhere else? That would have been a whole different process of how materials are obtained, right? And through that process, there is carbon emissions, right? So this is all these things that are producing, they're affecting the earth in a way. And so it's very important to think, where am I getting them? Are they recycled materials? How can I reuse them? How can I be very, think about these materials as I am going to be selecting them, right? So there is this sort of cycle, right, of getting the materials, shipping the materials, using the materials, recycling the materials at the end. So, and at the end also sustainability will have to do with the usage of the buildings. And so what if you are using materials that's going to make the house require less air conditioning, right? So you're building in a place where it's very hot, so you're using materials that's going to absorb the heat and is going to make it cool during the night. And so you're thinking of that, right? And you're also thinking of placing windows and transparent and clear materials in the right place so the light can come in. And you're also using solar panels and other things, right? And so now you're not just thinking materials that make it look good, materials that are structural, but materials that are making the building more sustainable and that are maybe requiring less use of electricity, so it has some sort of passive heating and cooling and lighting and all these things, right? So these are the top 3 things that I'm going to go over. So I want you to think about these. When it comes to materials, just think, when I'm designing, am I just thinking aesthetically? Am I just thinking structurally? Or am I just thinking sustainable, right? And ideally, you just should have all 3. So when it comes to materials, materiality has a lot of implications of design, and that's something that we've seen in this topic. Everything goes back to the idea of designs. And so materials, it's in a way for many years has to do with more the craft of the person. But as you're choosing materials, that's why I mentioned it's important to think about the idea of how it's going to affect the building throughout its lifetime. It's not going to just be for a little while. It's hopefully to the entirety of its lifetime until it needs to be sort of redone or reworked, right? But this is a combination through working with architects, engineers, and the builders, all to ensure the materials are really adequate for the building. So the first part I'm going to talk about is the structural, right? The structural side, I mentioned there's 3 components. So the first one will have to do with the structural. So in this example, you see a couple of images of materials that are breaking, right? This wood, concrete, the ceiling, water is pouring out. And so this has to do with specific, like I mentioned, characteristics of properties of the specific material. So you need to know where to place which material. So if you continue with this education, you'll go a lot deeper into understanding the materials and understanding each of its properties, right? So there's some key terminology that you need to think about. One of those is stress and strain. In this case, number 1 would be tensile. So think about when things are being stretched out, pulled away. F stands for forces. So forces pushing at each other eventually is going to create some sort of, it's going to break. Compression is the opposite, forces coming in and sort of squishing it in, right? And shear has to do with forces acting on opposite sides. So think of like an earthquake, right? Sort of coming in. There's a lot that you can sort of think about when it comes to understanding the materials. This is some sort of the graph that you start to sort of understand, right? Here in this case, we see the brittle materials, we see the materials that have plastic deformation. You start to understand the characteristics of each material. So materials that are more elastic has the ability to deform and bend, right? We see anything that's elastic, you've seen that before, right? anything that brittle materials, they have low elastic levels, right? They break very easily. They're not able to bend. Stiff materials is they are able to, the stiffness is a measure of the force required to push or pull a material to its elastic limit, right? So how stiff a material can be, right? And so not only thinking of its elasticity or properties, think about how does it relate to how does it respond to fire? How does it respond to water? How does it respond to lighting? How does it respond to different things, right? So each of those materials, there's this idea of conductivity, reflection, this idea of permeability, the idea of resistant combustions, and so on, right? So if you really don't want let's say a building that there's a lot of fires in the area, building with materials that are not easily going to catch on fire is going to be very, very important, right? So this is sort of going back to the idea of the types of loads. These are the 5 of the fundamental of the terminology that you need to sort of remember. One would be compression, and we mentioned how forces going together, tension, forces going apart, shear, forces acting sort of in opposite direction, torsion, this idea of rotating, right? And bending, forces sort of on the lateral side, but coming at different locations as well. So think about, right, how does a material react structurally, and where does the material come, where does it go? This is where structurally sustainable comes in. A life cycle, this is a life cycle of a building, has to do with the processing of the raw materials, the extraction and processing of raw materials, right? Manufacturing and packaging, the transportation, number 3, of the finished product, maintaining the material in the use, and the possible recycle and its reuse in its final disposal, right? So this sort of becomes the life cycle of a material, right? Extraction, manufacturing, transportation, maintaining and usage, recycling and reuse, and disposal. And so this is sort of that same idea, right? Acquisitions, processing, transportation, reuse, use and disposal, and sort of recycling, right? And here's the last one, the disposal, recycle, and reuse. So now we come a little bit more into the aesthetics. We understand materials have different properties, have different characteristics, but what about the aesthetics? I want you to pause this video and take a look at this image and think about it. This is a house, but if this was your house, would you like it, yes or no? Or what do you think of this house? I want you to pause this video and really think about it. How do you feel seeing these materials in this house? Take a couple of seconds. Let's take a look at the interior, and I want you to continue thinking about that question. So what did you think? Do you feel this house looks like a house, or maybe looks more like an institution, a hospital, commercial building, a museum of sorts, right? Maybe not really a house. Maybe you thought more emotionally. Maybe you're like, it feels very cold, very rigid. It feels, very serious, right? Not a happy house or something, right? And so there's different things that, besides the structural, that has to do with the idea of this, the emotional and the physical side of the aesthetics. Also think about materiality. Think about how materials can be manipulated to your own usage. So in this case, we're all familiar with brick, but it's very easy for us to see brick this way. When I would tell you to draw brick, this is most likely what you would draw. But look at what they're doing here. They're extruding, they're creating different patterns, right? It's still providing similar ideas, but now it's sort of, now it's creating this interesting patterns, right? Also see how they're combining two different materials, so the combination of materials is going to be very important. So what do you think of this house? Do you like it better than the previous one? And so this is sort of a good explanation when it comes to manipulation of materials. In this case, this is wood, right? It's structural because the building's holding. It's they're using a specific material, but they're using wood in a way that this architect really just wanted to, celebrate wood. That it's very evident that it's being used, that wood is being used, right? So it's not just simply using wood, but it's how can you sort of use it, and to once you get to know its property, once you get to know its aesthetic, once you get to know its sustainability factors, how can you really use it to your own advantage, right? So think about concrete, think about wood, think about brick, think about stones, think about stucco, right? All of those are materials, and they don't have to just be used as is. They can still be explored as to how you want them to be used, right? So this is the interior. How would you feel if you're eating or having a lunch here, right? I did get to go here a couple of years back, and it's this place called Sunny Hills Cake Shop, and they sell this really interesting cake cookie kind of thing, and really really good. Brought back some home, brought back home some of them. This is in Japan, but just being inside, right? It's a really interesting experience, right? What do you think? Does it look like a tree house? Look like a nest? Like, what do you think when you see this building? And also, right, when it comes to transparency, this is called the House NA, also in Japan, and the architect really wanted the idea of transparency. So materials have play with also the idea of how things feel, right? This house feels very light. If all of this would be the same house, but it'd be concrete, it would feel a lot heavier, a lot bigger, right? But this feels almost like it's floating, right? But it's going to create an effect, not only visual, but it's going to create an effect for the users, right? So imagine you lived in this house. How would you feel? Do you like the whole transparency, that it's very open, that everyone walking in the neighborhood can see you, right? Maybe some of you will add more curtains, right? As the people who are living there, I'm sure, have, right? But all of that starts to play on the how people live and use. Your materials that you choose will affect how people live, right? This is sort of another view, right? This is another example of transparency. So in that case, this person is standing about there, right? You can't really see that person. So it's this idea that you can have a very limited visibility. You can see this garden, right? So exploring the idea of, do you want transparency? Do you want non-transparent? Do you want light? Do you want not light? Do you want this? What is it that your goal is, right? And so the last thing I want to talk about is LEED. So LEED stands for Leadership in Energy and Environmental Design, and it's this certification program that gives buildings a certification, sort of like an award or stamp, right, that says that you have received this accreditation. And there's different levels depending on the amount of points that you receive. So the more points obviously gives you a higher certification. So in this case, LEED Platinum will be the highest. And so what that means is, how do you get points? You get points by thinking of designing a building that thinks of how to make the world, more sustainable, or your design is going to be more sustainable. So we talked about obtaining materials. So instead of bringing materials that are in South America, you buy local, you're going to get more points. If you start building using green materials, natural materials, you get another point. If you start building a material that has solar panels and it has having some sort of passive wind and cross ventilation, it's going to get more points, right? So thinking of how the building is not only being from the beginning, how the materials are being brought, but also how is it going to function, right? Is it going to function in a way that that is going to require less energy, right? Or when you leave, you're just like, here's a beautiful design, but I didn't think of how it's going to affect eventually the usage of electricity and and energy consumption and all these things, right? Every building is requiring some sort of energy. So the more you think about it, the more you're being conscious of that, right? And you can think about placement of lighting, of windows, placement of the types of materials to absorb. All of that comes back to that same idea, right? Some buildings are trying to go into what it's called net zero. Net zero is basically saying I need zero energy. It's completely off the grid in a way, right? It has solar panels for energy. It has some created so the wind can heat it as well, and it has water filtration and retention. There's all these different things, and that's sort of it becomes a little harder at times for depending on the region and the scale of the project, but it is still possible to a certain point, right? So to summarize everything, how do materials affect design? They truly affect it, right? Aesthetically, structurally, sustainability. This is a project that I'm sort of working on, and if you look at it, right, this is sort of the facade, the entrance. And if I were to change when it comes to materials, and I were to change this into brick, right, this building completely changes, right? This design from wood to brick changes. So that's part of what we're doing. We're exploring the types of materials aesthetically, structurally, how it can be built, how can the materials get obtained, and is it going to have any effect in any sustainability. So thank you all for watching this video, and learning about the different types of material. Thank you for watching.